Hey everyone, it's Retro Renovo with a analysis on the latest modding choices. PS2 versus GameCube modified consoles shootout. If you have $100 or $200 max, what do you choose? I'm going to be looking at a couple different key metrics here. I'm not going to post any scores or whatever. Suffice it to say, we have a lot of options right now. We're almost into 2023. Things are crazy. Let's limit it to the PS2 and the GameCube. We're seeing things I never thought we would see before. Solid state drives in a PlayStation 2 functioning very well, and microcomputer processors, bolt-on modifications to the GameCube. Now, what do we have here? Well, this screen is going to be the reason why, and we'll return to this, why I think right out of the gates here that the GameCube is the system to choose. If you have $100 to $200, you have one of these systems laying around. Now, let's not include the price of admission just to get a console. First things first. Did you ever think you would see a Raspberry Pi inside of a GameCube? Well, here we are. The Picoboot has become famous at this point. It is the most advanced modification available as of right now, mid-October 2022. The Picoboot is the most sophisticated mod, arguably, for the GameCube. It consists of a Raspberry Pi Nano with an SD card and a custom BIOS. So, one of the things I would like to highlight is that this modification is marketed as very easy, beginner friendly, and a whole host of YouTube content exists out there already that carefully walks you through all of the ways that you can perform this mod step by step in a very clear and concise manner. However, I find it possible that many viewers will maybe take this as a very much beginner project and their first foray into soldering and electronics repair will be on a GameCube. Maybe it will be on a rare GameCube. In my instance, I tried it on a Japanese Orange Spice GameCube, not that rare. I found it at a local store, basically at a very low price. The owner of the store knew that he had a very slim chance of selling it and just wanted to cut his losses. So I picked it up, and he asked essentially, what do you want to do with this? I mean, you can't play any games on it. I just took it in on a trade, and it was a risky move for me to even take this as a trade. And I said, well, there are some mods out there now that are very common, and, this guy hadn't heard of anything in the modding scene. That's not his gig. But long story short, I took it home, and with, some reading and some watching, I figured out, okay, let's do this mod. And one of the things that's of note here, if this is your first dive into a modification, you really need to, I would say, go ahead, look at the GitHub page, and I'm going to have links to everything that I'm talking about, the materials that I've used, the products that I've used, and a disclaimer here, I'm not sponsored even remotely. I don't have anything paid for whatsoever. This is all out of my pocket with, no intent to be reimbursed or any agreements. And this is also not a push to have anybody do this. Do not take this as a permission slip to take this on as your first project. Now, I'm starting with the GameCube here. We will get to the PS2. You could skip ahead if you don't care about this. That's fine. So let's begin here. The Picoboot is a very minor, I would say, in terms of electronics repair, it's very minor. But in terms of console interaction, it's kind of a deep dive here. We are going to actually remove the heat sinks, and you'll notice in my video here that there might be some things to the very well-trained eye, hey, he's making a mistake here. And you know what? I have about 20 years experience in soldering. I'm not going to say I've been an expert for 20 years, but messing around with electronics, doing repairs, I made mistakes during this video. And this is after doing my research. I still made mistakes, partially because, I didn't use a helping hands device to hold a circuit board. I didn't have a magnifying glass, and I really didn't have adequate task lighting. And the other part of it is I just kind of rushed a little bit in a couple places. So, long story short, if this is your first attempt at any kind of modification, maybe hit the pause button and find a way, find some junk laying around that you don't care about. Maybe even eBay junk. You could filter on parts only, and buy some broken stuff, or maybe just take a donation, ask somebody for junk, and tear it apart and practice getting solder hot and flowing and all the basic stuff. I mean, I'm not going to get into that. Don't let this be your first attempt. The creator of this mod has actually very explicitly said, don't do this without practice first. However, and I'm saying this just to kind of reinforce, there's a lot of YouTube content out there right now that does not adequately explain, even despite the intentions of the creator himself. The YouTube content, in my opinion, is marketing this mod as beginner friendly. And it's my estimation that this mod and attempts to complete this mod will essentially result in the destruction, or at least irreparable damage, or maybe irreparable damage, but damage nonetheless to many, many Gamecubes that have otherwise survived over 20 years. And they would have no reason to be damaged other than people seeing a YouTube video and saying, hey, I'm going to rip this thing apart and try this mod. Now, we're going to get to exactly where the problem comes in. But first, I'd like to mention, if you're going to attempt to do any of these things, any mod at all, or just tinkering around, you want to make sure that you have the right tools. If you find yourself needing to borrow tools, that's a dead giveaway that you're not ready. If you are kind of struggling to understand, well, how do I even begin? That's a red flag. If you don't have a dedicated workspace, that's a red flag. If you don't understand, basically, if you don't understand one of the many things that are involved here, you're not ready. Now, that's not to say you need to be an expert. You don't need to know the melting points of different types of solder and all this other stuff. You don't have to have top flight materials. You don't need a $200 soldering iron. You do not need hundreds of dollars of equipment. You don't need, et cetera, et cetera. You don't need that. You just need a basic understanding, but you also need patience. If you don't have the patience to go in here and at least do some due diligence and read the GitHub pages ahead of time, read the bug logs. There's a backlog of reported bugs for the Picoboot mod, and I don't see any of them being covered on any YouTube channels. So what's an example of that? There's a discussion happening right now. Last I checked, about 2 weeks ago, so late September, early October, that the wire length is a determining factor in whether or not this mod will be successful. What does that mean? Well, if you have a certain voltage, a certain amount of electrons trying to go a certain distance, and maybe they don't have enough power to reach their destination in the first place, the length of wire will create so much resistance that by the time that electron flow gets to where it needs to go, the processing unit can't interpret that data accurately and just kind of freaks out and says, no, I'm not doing it, and quits. That's very much in layman's terms what's happening. In the terms of this GameCube, we have some unconfirmed reports that wire length is a determining factor. So what does that mean? When you get in here and you need to make these soldering connections to the Picoboot, to the Raspberry Pi chip, if you cut your wires too long, people are saying 6 centimeter max. Mine are about that. But they're saying if you go over that by any, margin, the mod will fail. And there's still an open discussion on whether or not this is true. And this is just one aspect of it. There are also people out there that are manufacturing soldering templates. And these templates are arguably incorrect. They're bypassing some of the wiring that the mod creator himself said that you need, and people are having issues with that. And there could be long-term detrimental effects if you solder on to a chip in the incorrect fashion. Those of you who are familiar with other mods, and I don't claim to be an expert here, but there are some implications in the modding community for other systems where the mods are causing long-term harm. And so we're not sure right now if this is one of them. I went out and I took that risk. I understood the risk. I understood that this could go poorly. And so I used a console that had no sentimental value to me. The cost to me was relatively low, and I was okay to proceed. So what do I mean that this is pretty intrusive? Well, you just saw the heat sinks come off here in my demo. That's pretty deep in, if you ask me. Now, there are alternative mods for the GameCube community at this point. However, over the last couple of years, during certain global events, certain materials have become nearly impossible to get a hold of. Supply chain difficulties have only strengthened, and we're continuing to see these issues manifesting even now. And one of the sad victims of that was the GC loader. Now, I have a modified GameCube, also a Japanese orange spice cube with the GC loader. The GC loader, on a scale of 1 to 10, in modding difficulty and intrusiveness. So how deep are you digging? A 0 means you're not even opening up the console. A 10 means you're reballing the CPU, right? The GC loader is like a 2. You open up the tray, you take the shell off, and you plug this thing in. And it essentially serves the same function as the Picoboot mod, and serves as basically a replacement for the Raspberry Pi Nano. It's just all in one. You plug and play. You literally just plug this thing in and you're done. Now, there are other aspects to it. If you want to have a very nice aesthetic finish to the modification, you could get some products from Laser Bear Industries. I'll be providing a link in the description if you want to go check those out. But anyway, suffice it to say, you need some practice, and I'm showing some footage here, some B-roll, where, I'm arguably, I don't remember exactly where these mistakes occur, but there are instances in this mod where you need to bridge some pins, and that's not difficult. However, there are parts of this where any rushing or hurrying, or if you're not taking notes, right? Note taking is very crucial here. You want to keep track of your wire colors. And I think a combination of all of those things resulted in me making a slight mistake. I don't know if there was a bridged contact or exactly what happened, but what really resulted was something that I had the ability to troubleshoot. Now, and that's another thing too. There are various modding communities out there now, and you'll see when you go out, and I do recommend go to the GitHub page, go to the GitHub pages for any mods you want to do, and really dig in there. Most, if not all of them, have a corresponding Discord page. Get in there and read. So what I think happened in my instance was it was a combination of my flux wasn't quite behaving as much as it wasn't behaving as well as I expected. And I think I may have created a bridge on the IPL chip. The IPL chip is essentially the device, the logic circuit that we are trying to circumvent. That Picoboot is basically leveraging an internal safety check, essentially, and it's just kind of bypassing a security feature. So if you aren't sure and you start getting anomalous results, say you go through here, you make all your solder connections, you plug everything back in, and you fire up the system and you get a no post, you get nothing. It's just dead, essentially. That's what mine did. It turned on, the LED came on. This is a stock system, so the LED was orange, and the fan came on. Now, I had no idea where to go from there. So I literally, one by one, pulled all of these wire connections off. I desoldered everything. I didn't just heat up the contacts. I didn't just heat up the joints and remove the wires. I actually desoldered them with soldering braid. I will also list the links to recommended braid in the description. But anyway, I had to go through. I found out that the Picoboot, where you initially flash it with some software, the software had vanished. It had attempted to boot and then maybe dropped the software off the chip. It was no longer in memory. So I had to not only start from scratch from wiring, but I had to flash the device again. And that just created even more possible points of failure and damage. You'll see this end result is not where I ultimately determined to place the device. I actually determined to place the device where the creator recommended, which was on the side of the fan. This was before I knew that I had a failed attempt. So once I got in here, you'll see the Kapton tape. It was fine. It could have worked out well, but I ended up cutting some length off the wires and redoing everything just to be sure. So where do we go from here? Let's take a look at the PS2. Now, you might notice that's not a stock PS2 fan. And essentially, the PS2, in many people's minds, is the penultimate retro console at this point. It's crazy to call it retro, but it has thousands of games. I think in English, there are 2,000 to 3,000 games, maybe 6,000 games in total. But what do you get, right? So I would say, rating this on quality of life right out of the gates, you need to use you need to use a software called FreeMcBoot, and it's just a custom BIOS, essentially. Now, your cost of entry there is very low. You can make your own memory card that has FreeMcBoot. There are many, many options out there on YouTube that'll walk you through it. There are many tutorials online. But if you take a look at what FreeMcBoot offers, it just doesn't look as nice as what we will see here with the GameCube. So now you'll notice that I'm not using thumbnails. I've even read for FreeMcBoot and Open PlayStation Loader, the OPL, that if you go the lengths to try to upload thumbnails, you could actually cause more harm than good. So what I will say, though, for the PS2, putting a flash drive in there is really cool. Now, you're not getting any performance benefits. You'll have the same return on investment as a spinning media drive, a spinning disk drive, but you will get reduced heat, I'm pretty sure, and you'll get maybe reduced fan speed. You'll see I had the Noctua fan. Here's another instance, right? That's a 12-volt fan, and I believe it might be on a 5-volt rail. So what happens when the 12-volt fan gets the 5-volt feed? There's a general consensus out there that it's just going to run a little bit slower, and that's likely the case. But we just don't know. These things haven't been done in the past. It's easy to surmise that this fan is just going to get less voltage, and that's the end of it, right? It's just going to run slower. But we really just don't know. Another metric I want to take a look at here, of course, there's quality of life, right? I think the GameCube wins for reasons we're going to get into here in a second. Cost of entry, I would say they're about tied. However, not just cost of entry, but there's an intangible cost, right? So you could get a hard drive for the PS2, a solid state drive if you want, and it's still pretty low cost. I mean, storage is very cheap these days if you wanted to go that route, or you could even get a spinning disk. It'll be the same result. The real hidden cost, let's call it the hidden cost. How many hidden costs are there? With the Picoboot, there's the hidden cost that we don't really know how long it's going to last. But there's the same thing with the PS2. Now, we don't really know long term if a fan mod, so this isn't really, this is kind of splitting hairs, but the fan mod should be okay. We've seen issues. Anybody who's familiar with the GD EMU on the Dreamcast, there's something to do with overheating, and I haven't dug into it that much. It's going to be one of my next projects, but we're only looking at GameCube and PS2 here. PS2, thousands of library titles, right? You can have a library with 4, 5, maybe even 6,000 titles, arguably. I think that's what I've read, if you have all the languages. And you can fit it all on a solid state drive. But in terms of getting a nice presentation on a modern television, I captured footage here with the RetroTink 5X Pro, and it's still just kind of lackluster. I mean, there are some different options. Some people say that you could modify each game and calibrate each game differently. So I just kind of found a happy medium and tried to apply some different things, and nothing really blew my mind. So it could be the case that emulation is really the way to go for PS2. It could still potentially hold its own. However, for what you get when you do modify the PS2, it just doesn't have the same feel as the GameCube with the Picoboot, or even a GC loader for that matter. And if you have one extra element for the GameCube, it's really a no contest, right? So one of the limitations here, as we watch Kratos battle a Hydra, is right now, and this could change, and it probably will change immediately after I release this video here, but the FreeMcBoot OPL combo does not support loading PS1 games. If that were not the case, and a modified PS2 with FreeMcBoot, OPL, and a hard drive could load PS1 games, I think it would be slightly skewed towards the PS2. It would be a real contest. Now, there are other players out there, like the original Xbox. I'm going to save that for a future review. It's a next project of mine in the queue, just to share a secret. But right now, at face value, right? So here are the metrics again: quality of life, longevity, cost, and hidden cost. So quality of life, for reasons that you'll see abundantly clear, Swiss, when loaded on the GameCube, is phenomenal. Swiss feels like some sort of extension of what the GameCube was supposed to be to begin with. It feels natural. Everything just has a really extremely high quality build feel to it. Everything just works. The memory card management, everything, progressive scan, everything that you can go and interact with in Swiss just feels really executive, and it feels like something you would have to pay for. OPL, FreeMcBoot, it feels very late 90s. I don't know how else to describe it. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. But in terms of quality of life, what are the features that are going to make things, easier on you to manage? I've noticed that, and this is kind of a fringe example, my Retro Fighters Defender PlayStation wireless controller drops out every time I try to use OPL. It'll just drop the connection. I don't know exactly what's going on. It could be because of the hard drive modification, whatever, but there are these hidden costs, right? So that's a hidden cost. We don't know exactly what peripherals are going to work. We don't know if these mods are causing some kind of damage, right? We don't know if there's a hidden cost here just yet for these different areas, but the hidden cost that's readily available and palpable are these, superficial kind of things. Lack of thumbnails, controllers won't connect. And with FreeMcBoot, also to get OPL to work, you really need to be confident going in there and managing a file system. It's kind of rare these days for at least younger people maybe to be familiar with a file system. And what do I mean by that? Well, to get FreeMcBoot loaded yourself, you could go out and buy a FreeMcBoot, but that's not exactly what I'm reviewing here. If you want to create, soup to nuts, a modified PS2 with FreeMcBoot, you have to go make FreeMcBoot onto a memory card, and you need a certain USB stick, potentially a certain USB stick. Some are incompatible. You have to copy and paste files within a file system that could be very temperamental. And it kind of has this high cost of entry. You have to have a high knowledge if something should go wrong to be able to troubleshoot it. And I've found that some of the communities out there for both modified GameCubes and PS2s are really not receptive to you not doing your homework. So, as a passive observer in some of these forums and even reaching out a couple times, you got to do your homework here. You might not just have answers spoon-fed to you, and you could be running into something that's never been seen before. So you have to be comfortable at the ground level with the basics. If you don't have the basics, just kind of hit pause and go out and start learning, and you'll see, FreeMcBoot, as good as it is, it just doesn't have that executive feel. I don't know what else to say about it. I would go with Swiss. The GameCube is just a powerhouse, and we should really talk about that real clinch factor. What's the clincher for the GameCube in 2022? Well, let's take a look. So what's the clincher for GameCube right now, the modified GameCube? What makes that stand above all the competition? Well, in my mind, it's the compatibility, if you have it, with the Game Boy player. Now, the Game Boy player is something that over the last couple of years has, I think, doubled in price. It's pretty cost prohibitive. And just to get the pieces you need to make it work, you're going to be well over the cost of doing a couple of these mods. So, what do we see here? Final Fantasy VI Advance loading on a Game Boy player on a modified Japanese Orange Spice GameCube running Swiss via the Picoboot. And it looks amazing. Everything's scaled correctly. There are people out there that would argue that you're better off doing emulation, but there's nothing better than having your modified Orange Spice GameCube loaded up with an EverDrive, and it has that nice carry handle on it. And if you want to do some slick memory card management, you could take all of your files, back them up with an SD Gecko, or maybe even an SD2 SP2 card, which I have in mine. I'll put the links down in the description here. But yeah, you can just really make your GameCube into an archive. That's kind of what I'm getting at here. Anybody can modify, anybody can emulate, but if you want to have an actual archive, a physical archive, guess what? The GameCube discs won't last forever. Say you have thousands of dollars of rare titles. Maybe they're not thousands of dollars when you bought them, but they're thousands of dollars now. And you're not going to risk taking those games places. I have a couple titles that I just moved them once or twice. Just, sliding them around on my shelf. They got scratches in the plastic sleeve because the plastic now is becoming old. It's oxidizing, and now it's becoming brittle. And even moving and sliding these cases around gently, even standing them vertically and sliding them between other games, has scratched the sides of the disc case. In one instance, it was an original Pikmin, the Black Label Pikmin. And I think another one may have been maybe the Legend of Zelda Master Quest double disc that came out with Wind Waker. If you pre-ordered it, that got a scratch in it too, just from moving it vertically. So with the GameCube, it wins, in my opinion, pretty handsomely here. You're seeing all this crazy capability. You could sit down with titles that you have backed up and just make a real archive. You can have a legitimately future-proof archive for future generations. If you go ahead and do this mod, and maybe you're like me and you have consoles laying around, as they pile up and other things happen in life, you don't have time to get to them and they just collect dust. So if that's where they are ultimately going to go, on a shelf and collecting dust and maybe played once or twice a year, in my opinion, if you only have so many minutes a day to do stuff that you want to do and you only have a limited budget, $100, $150, $200, go through the motions, learn about the GameCube, learn about the Picoboot. If you could find a GC loader, good luck. I think you're going to break your budget just on that. So right now we're talking Picoboot. In the future, you can use potentially, it's hypothetical right now, but you should be able to have wireless capability with a wireless version of the Raspberry Pi Nano. So they're working on it. I would say maybe hold off if you're confident that you're going to go down this road and you do not want to do rework, right? You don't want to crack the system open again. Maybe you narrowly avoided disaster. You don't want to, with other projects, you don't really want to risk it here. Maybe you're not as confident, what have you. Or you don't want to wreck your childhood system. Anything of sentimental value, don't do it. But otherwise, hold off until they add wireless capability. I don't think you're going to get any crazy Wi-Fi features here, but you should be able to get Wi-Fi updates, which in and of itself will be fantastic. So, so basically, in a nutshell here, just to recap, PS2 versus the GameCube, as good as the PS2 is a long-term system, a solid, rock-solid system, with a ton of titles, thousands and thousands of titles, 3, 4, 5, 6,000 titles, depending how many languages you could speak. In my opinion, as a legitimate physical archive, closing in on the year 2023 here, the GameCube wins. It has the quality of life, easy to use. I think it has a very long longevity, a very solid longevity, really low hidden costs, and the costs themselves are low. So anyway, a future video, if you guys like this and this gets some interest and engagement, I will be doing a Xbox modification, an OG Xbox, and in the pipeline after that, probably a Dreamcast. So anyway, like and subscribe if you want to. I should have said that in the beginning, right? This is Retro Renovo. Thanks for listening.